It is moving through the village right now. Massive, hair-matted, reddish-black. A body built like a barrel of muscle, taller than the doorways it passes. And ahead of it rolls the smell, a thick, rotting, suffocating stench that gets into your throat and tilts the whole world sideways. This is the Mapinguari, the most feared creature in the Amazon. And it is walking unhurried through homes that still have hammocks strung in them, because the people who lived here are gone, not killed, gone. They took their lives apart, board by board, and carried everything across the river to get away from exactly this thing. The huts still stand. A child's toy still sits in the dirt. The cooking fire only died a week ago. They left all of it behind because they found this creature's tracks in the mud near their homes, and they decided together that they could never sleep here again.
The story I want to tell you today is not about a blurry photo or a frightened witness. It is about something much harder to wave away. It is about what it takes to make an entire community look at a set of footprints and decide to abandon their homes forever. Because here is the thing that stops you cold once you start digging. That abandoned village on the Purus was not a one-off thing.
Across the Amazon basin, more than 400 indigenous groups, speaking over 270 different languages, have a name for this creature. People separated by hundreds of miles of trackless rainforest, people who have never met one another and never could have. All describe the same animal, the same overwhelming smell that drops a grown man where he stands, the same trail of snap trees and flattened vines left behind in the dark, the same deep, rolling roar that carries for miles. When that many people who have never spoken paint the exact same monster, you start to wonder what they're all looking at. And this question, the Mapinguari, might be the strangest one in all of South America, because it sits right on the seam between folklore and hard science in a way that almost nothing else does. To feel why people fear this thing enough to flee from it, you only have to listen to a man named Giovaldo Caritiana. Giovaldo was a hunter, a member of the Caritiana people of the Western Amazon, a man who had spent his entire life in that forest and knew every animal in it. He was out hunting near a place his tribe calls the Cave of the Mapinguari, when, in his words, it came toward the village making a tremendous noise. It stopped when it got close to him. And then the smell hit. He told reporters that the stench made him dizzy and exhausted in seconds. He fainted, collapsed unconscious right there on the forest floor. When he came to, the creature was gone, and the forest around him was destroyed. Trees knocked flat, vines torn down, a path of devastation cut through the jungle. His father, Lucas, went back to the site with him and confirmed what he saw.
A lifelong hunter who knew that forest better than his own home was knocked unconscious by a smell. And to understand why a footprint can empty a whole village, we have to go back to the very beginning.
Almost everything you're about to hear comes from people relaying what they saw, or from researchers carefully writing down what local communities told them. These are accounts. They are not laboratory results. When I tell you a village relocated after finding tracks, I am telling you that is what was reported by the people who study these communities. Not that a camera crew filmed it happening. I am going to lay all of it out as honestly as I can, the parts that are eerie and the parts that fall apart under a microscope. And then I'm going to let you decide for yourself. Deal? Good. Let's get into it. But before the relocations, I want to stay with that consistency for one more minute because it is genuinely the strongest card this whole mystery holds, and it deserves a fair hearing. The Amazon is not one culture, it is hundreds. The tribes scattered across that 2 million square mile basin are divided by enormous distances, by impassable terrain, by completely unrelated languages, and many of them have had no contact with one another across their entire histories. And yet, when researchers go from group to group and ask about the dangerous animals of the deep forest, the same creature surfaces again and again under dozens of different names. The Caritiana call it one thing. The Machiguenga of Peru describe a creature they call the Segamai. Others know it as the Juma, the Cape Lobo, the Wolf's Cape, the Mao de Pilau, the Pestle Hand, the Pay de Garafa, the Bottlefoot. Different words, different languages, and underneath them all, the same animal. Huge, hairy, foul-smelling, hard to kill, walking sometimes on 4 legs and sometimes on 2. Skeptics have a reasonable answer to this, and I will give it to you straight. Shared folklore can spread, fear is universal, and the human imagination tends to converge on similar monsters. A big, smelly, dangerous forest giant is not a wildly original idea, and stories travel further and faster than we assume. That is fair, but the counter-argument is the one that gnaws at you. It is one thing for unrelated peoples to independently invent a scary giant. It is another thing entirely for them to independently invent the same scary giant down to the oddly specific details, the backward-pointing feet, the reddish hair, the navel as the one weak spot, the smell that knocks you out cold. Those are not the universal furniture of monster stories. Those are weirdly precise, weirdly consistent, and weirdly anatomical. And that precision is exactly what pulled a serious scientist into this in the first place. Sometime in the late 1990s, a Dutch primatologist named Mark van Roosmalen heard a story that he could not shake. Roosmalen is not a man on the fringe of science. He is one of the most accomplished mammal hunters of his generation. A researcher who has discovered and named multiple new species of monkey in the Amazon, the kind of biologist whose name carries weight. And what he heard was this. Along the Rio Purus in the Brazilian state of Amazonas, the people of a riverside village had found footprints near their settlement, tracks they did not recognize, tracks they believed belonged to the Mapinguari. What they did next is the heart of this entire story. They did not call anyone. They did not set up a camera or a trap or stand guard with rifles. They picked up their village and moved it. The entire community crossed to the other side of the river and rebuilt their homes there, put in a wide band of moving water between themselves and the spot where the tracks were found. According to the accounts Roosmalen collected, some of the men of the village could not sleep for days afterward. And as late as October of 2014, years and years after the event, none of the people of that village had dared to set foot back into that stretch of forest. Whatever they believed they were running from, they were still running from it more than a decade later. Now sit with the practicality of that for a second, because that is what makes it land. Moving a village is not a panic. A panic lasts a night. Moving a village is labor. It is taking apart the walls and the roofs you built with your hands, ferrying every possession you own across a river, choosing new ground, and rebuilding all of it from nothing. It is a decision made in daylight with clear heads after the fear has had time to cool. These were not tourists spooked by a noise in the dark. These were people who had lived in that forest their entire lives, who knew every real animal in it, and who looked at a set of tracks and concluded that the only sane option left was to abandon their land. People do not do that lightly. People almost never do that at all. And here is what elevates the Purus case from a single strange anecdote into something with a pattern behind it. It was not the only time. Go back to September of 1981 to a place called Valeria, and you find almost the same story playing out a generation earlier. A woman named Lydia was at the edge of the forest near her house at night when she was startled by a long howling cry coming out of the trees. She ran inside to her father, a man named Teofilo. Teofilo grabbed his rifle and went out to where the family cow was tied up in the open, defenseless. And there, in the dark, he saw it. He fired his gun at the creature and then retreated back to the house. The next morning, the shot apparently having done nothing at all, the whole village made its decision. Every family packed up and resettled on the bank of the river. If you have watched this channel for a while, that pattern of collective flight might ring a bell. We have talked before about how in cultures all over the world, the deepest cryptid fears tend to crystallize into rules. The places you do not go, the trails you do not walk after dark, the stretch of woods the elders warn the children away from without ever fully explaining why. What makes the Mapinguari extraordinary is that the fear does not stop at a rule. It escalates all the way to physically picking up and leaving. Most cryptid lore tells you where not to go. The Mapinguari tells you when to abandon where you already are.
Two villages, two riverbanks, separated by nearly 20 years and many miles of jungle, and yet the response was identical. When the Mapinguari comes near, you do not fight it, and you do not study it, you just leave. That is the detail I keep coming back to. In so many cryptid stories from around the world, and we have covered a lot on this channel, the human response is fascination. People grab cameras, they organize expeditions, they want to capture the thing, prove it, and get famous off of it. The Mapinguari is one of the only creatures in the world where the consistent, repeated, multi-generational human response is the opposite. It is total retreat. It is the kind of fear that doesn't want a photograph.
It just wants distance. And to me, that says something about how this creature sits in the minds of the people who share its forest. It is not a curiosity to them. It is a fact of life and a deadly one. And the reason it inspires that kind of fear rather than the fascination we attach to North America's Bigfoot comes down to one fundamental difference in how the creature behaves. The Sasquatch of the Pacific Northwest in almost every account runs from people. It is shy, it flees. It wants nothing to do with us. The Mapinguari is the opposite, and that inversion is the whole reason it is so terrifying. According to the people who fear it, the Mapinguari does not flee the hunter. It hunts the hunter. It comes toward the village, not away from it. It is an aggressor. The Brazilian novelist Marcio Souza, who has spent his life steeped in Amazon folklore, put it in a way that stuck with me. The Mapinguari takes its revenge on people who transgress, people who go where they should not go, or who harvest more animals or more plants than they actually need. That last part opens up a whole dimension of this creature that pure monster stories miss. Because in much of the Amazon, the Mapinguari is not simply a predator, it is a guardian. It is the forest's enforcer, a protector of the deep places that punishes greed and cruelty. In this telling, the creature is sometimes said to be followed by a retinue of peccaries, the wild pigs of the jungle, moving with it as an escort. It twists palm trees to the ground to feed on their hearts. And it descends on those who overhunt, who set cruel traps, who take more than the forest can spare. One origin story says the Mapinguari was once a man, an Amazonian shaman who discovered the secret of immortality and grew so arrogant that the gods cursed him, transforming him into a monstrous beast doomed to wander the forest forever. The fear, in other words, is braided together with a moral order. The thing in the trees is not random, it is watching how you treat the forest, and it remembers. I want to hear from you on this one before we go deeper, because I know a lot of you who watch this channel live near or spend time in genuinely wild country. Have you ever been somewhere, a stretch of forest or a particular hollow, that the locals simply would not go into and would not fully explain why? Drop it in the comments. Those local no-go zones, the places everyone knows to avoid, show up again and again in stories like this one. And I read every single one you send. Now, to understand why the fear runs this deep, we have to look at what the people of the Amazon actually believe this creature can do. And this is where it gets genuinely strange. Let's build the creature piece by piece, the way the people of the Amazon describe it. Start with the size. When it rises up onto its hind legs, the mapinguari stands somewhere around 6.5 feet tall, and it is not lean. It is described as massively, powerfully built. A barrel-chested wall of muscle and coarse fur that ranges from reddish to brown to deep black. It is heavy enough, they say, that it snaps the roots of trees underfoot as it walks. Its arms end in enormous hooked claws. Claws compared to those of a giant anteater, but built on the scale of a giant armadillo's. Curved blades capable of tearing through almost anything in the forest. Then there is the smell, which is not a detail in these stories. It is the weapon. Account after account describes a stench so overpowering that it does not just disgust you, it disables you. It makes witnesses dizzy, lightheaded, nauseous. Remember Geovaldo, the hunter who fainted dead away? The 7 hunters who told researchers they had actually killed a mapinguari all said the same thing about why they brought back no proof. The smell of the carcass was so unbearable, so nauseating that they could not stand to be near it long enough to carry any part of it home. Whatever this creature is in the lore, its defining feature is a stink that functions like a chemical weapon, clearing the forest around it of any human who gets too close. And then we get to the trait that, more than any other, turns ordinary fear into the kind of fear that makes you abandon your home. The people of the Amazon say the mapinguari cannot be killed by normal weapons. Spears glance off it, arrows bounce away, and, in the modern accounts, bullets simply do not penetrate. Its hide, beneath that matted fur, is said to be armored, impervious, a living shield. Think back to Teofilo in Valeria, firing his rifle point blank at the thing in the dark and watching it do absolutely nothing. Think of Geovaldo, who in one version of his story emptied his gun into the creature before it finally reacted. If you believe, truly believe, that the monster in your forest cannot be shot, then there is no standing your ground. There is no defending your home. The only move left on the board is to run. And that, I think, is the real engine underneath every one of these village relocations. The relocations are the loudest evidence of this fear, but they are not the only encounters on record, and the individual stories are worth sitting with, because they are where the creature stops being an abstraction and becomes something a specific person in a specific place swears they stood in front of. Go back to 1975 to a mining camp along the Rio Jamauchim, south of the town of Itaituba in Para State. A mine worker named Mario Pereira de Sousa was at the camp when he heard a scream tear through the trees. He looked up and saw the creature coming toward him on his hind legs, moving unsteadily, lumbering, and trailing that same terrible stench that runs through every one of these accounts. Mario's encounter is one of the cases that researchers point to as among the most credible. A sober, working man with no reason to invent a monster, describing the same upright, foul-smelling giant that everyone else describes. Then there is the strangest detail in the entire body of mapinguari lore, and it comes from the Kanamari people of the Rio Jurua Valley. According to accounts collected by researchers, a group of Kanamari claim that they had once raised 2 infant mapinguaris. Baby ones. They fed them, the story goes, on a diet of bananas and milk, and kept them for a year, maybe 2. And then they let them go. The reason they released them is the part that tells you this was not a fairy tale dressed up to impress outsiders. They let the young creatures go because as the animals grew, their smell became so overwhelming, so genuinely unbearable, that the people simply could not stand to live near them anymore. There is something about that detail, the sheer mundane disgust of it, that is harder to dismiss than any roar in the dark. Nobody inventing a legend adds the part where the monster is just too smelly to keep as a pet. The encounters keep their shape across the decades, a woman gathering fruit near her house, disturbed by a mapinguari and fleeing back inside. A hunter stalking peccaries when the creature emerges from the trees and sends him running. A man cooking dinner in his hut when the entire straw roof is torn off above him, forcing him out into the open and into the creature's path. In one account, a hunter named Manuel, having shot a few peccaries, heard the mapinguari's call answer back, and a second call so powerful it shook the trees. He fled to the river and hid himself underwater, surfacing only to breathe, until the calls grew faint and the thing finally moved off deeper into the jungle. He stayed hidden in that water for hours. These are not the breathless, embellished stories of people trying to sell a documentary. They are small, frightened, human, and they all carry the same handful of details: the size, the smell, the sound, and the overpowering instinct to get away. This idea of a bulletproof beast is not some recent invention dreamed up for the internet. It is old, and we can put a remarkably precise date on it. On the 6th of November, 1913, a newspaper in the Brazilian state of Acre called the Cruzeiro do Sul ran an account of a creature the locals called the macaco de borracha. In Portuguese, that means the rubber monkey. And it earned that name for one specific chilling reason. It was described as a fabulous giant of the forest, an animal covered in long, tangled, matted hair. And that hair, the account said, repelled bullets. Shots fired at it bounced off as if it were made of rubber, hence the name. That same 1913 account named a man, a rubber tapper called Leoncio, who was said to have killed one of these rubber monkeys. The story goes that the creature appeared suddenly in front of him while he was traveling a trail in the bush near the Moa River in Acre. The detail that survives is the name and the place and the impossible animal, handed down through more than a century. And it tells us something important. The legend of the unkillable Amazon giant was already fully formed, already circulating in the rubber-tapping camps of the deep forest more than 100 years ago. This is not a story that got bigger on the internet. It is a story that has been frightening people in the Amazon for as long as anyone has been writing things down out there. And the timing of that account is not an accident, which is worth understanding. 1913 was the height of the Amazon rubber boom, the era when tens of thousands of seringueiros, rubber tappers, were pushed deep into the most remote and untouched corners of the forest, into Acre and the far western river systems, to bleed latex from wild rubber trees. These were men working alone, scattered across enormous distances, cutting trails into country that had never seen outsiders before. If there were a large, reclusive animal hiding in the deepest folds of that forest, the rubber boom was precisely the moment when human beings would have started bumping into it in numbers, in places no one had ever ventured. It may be no coincidence that this is exactly when the written accounts of the rubber monkey begin to pile up. The boom shoved people into the creature's last refuges, and the people came back out with stories. The folklore is even specific about the one way to kill it. Across many versions of the legend, the mapinguari has only a handful of vulnerable points on its entire armored body: the eyes, the mouth, and strangely the navel, the belly button, sometimes described as a second mouth or a soft spot in the center of its abdomen. Everywhere else, the weapons of men are useless. You can see how a belief like that would shape behavior. If the thing in the trees can only be killed by a perfect shot to the eye or the gut, fired by someone calm enough to aim while that stench is rolling over them and that roar is shaking the leaves, then for all practical purposes, it cannot be killed at all. And you, standing there with your rifle, are not the hunter anymore. You are the prey. I personally think this is the single most important detail in the whole legend, and it is the one people tend to skip past on their way to the more cinematic stuff. The one eye and the backward feet and the mouth in the belly. Because the invulnerability is the part that explains the human behavior. A scary animal you can shoot is a threat you can manage. You post a guard, you keep a gun by the door, you carry on with your life. But an animal you genuinely believe you cannot stop, no matter what you do, is not a threat you manage. It is a threat you flee. The bulletproof legend is the bridge between fear and that drastic, deliberate, pack up the whole village response. Take that one belief away, and I don't think those villages ever move. For most of the 20th century, that is exactly where the Mapinguari lived. In the camps and the villages, a terror passed mouth to mouth, dismissed by the outside world as pure superstition. And then a serious scientist did something almost no serious scientist ever does. He listened. His name was David Oren, and he was no crank. Oren was an American-born ornithologist with degrees from Yale and Harvard, and he served as the director of research at the Goeldi Museum in Belém, one of the most respected scientific institutions in the Brazilian Amazon. He was a rigorous, published, mainstream researcher. And at first he thought the Mapinguari was a myth, exactly like everyone else did. What changed his mind was the listening itself. Working in the Tapajos River Basin, Oren kept hearing the stories over and over from people he had no reason to doubt about anything else. And as a biologist, he started to notice something that the folklorists had missed. The way these hunters described the creature, when you stripped away the supernatural flourishes, did not actually sound like an ape. It sounded like something else entirely. Something that science said should not exist anymore. Oren came to a startling conclusion. The people of the Amazon were not describing a monster at all. They were describing a giant ground sloth, an animal that the textbooks insisted had been extinct for at least 10,000 years.
A Yale and Harvard scientist, the research director of a major museum, looked at the most feared monster in the Amazon and saw the face of an Ice Age animal that was supposed to have died long before the pyramids were built.
Once Oren framed it that way, the pieces started to click into place in a way that is honestly a little unsettling. The giant ground sloths were real. They were not dinosaurs, to be clear. They were Ice Age megafauna. But they were enormous, some species reaching the size of an elephant, and they roamed South America for millions of years. And look at the match. Ground sloths had long, coarse hair, and almost every hair sample recovered from preserved sloth remains is reddish, the exact color the Mapinguari is most often described as having. Ground sloths walked with their huge claws turned inward, which would force them to put weight on the sides of their feet, producing tracks that a person could easily read as pointing the wrong way. There is your backward feet legend, born from a perfectly real anatomical quirk. It gets better or worse depending on how you feel about sleeping in the jungle tonight. Some species of ground sloth had what are called dermal ossicles, small plates of bone embedded directly in their skin, forming a kind of natural armor under the hide. An animal with bone built into its skin would, in fact, be extraordinarily hard to kill with a spear or an arrow. There is your bulletproof rubber monkey, grounded in real biology. Oren even had an explanation for the dreaded smell, a scent gland on the belly, which could also account for the legend of a second mouth in the creature's abdomen, One by one, the parts of the story that sounded most like fantasy turned out to map onto the anatomy of a specific, real, supposedly extinct animal. That is the part that kept Oren up at night, and it is the part that gets me too. So Oren did what a scientist does. He went looking across the 1980s and 90s on self-funded expeditions into some of the most punishing terrain on Earth. He conducted formal interviews, eventually gathering more than 80, by some counts over 100 first-hand accounts from indigenous people, rubber tappers, and miners who said they had seen the creature. Among them were 7 hunters who claimed something much bolder, that they had actually shot and killed a mapinguari. Oren took their descriptions seriously enough to refine his own theory based on the details they gave him. The shape of the teeth, the size, the way it moved, even narrowing down which family of ground sloth it most resembled. And his theory genuinely evolved, which is the mark of an honest researcher rather than a true believer locked onto an answer. In his first major paper, published in 1993, Oren argued that the mapinguari best matched a mylodontid ground sloth, pointing to the bony armor under the skin and the curved feet to explain the bulletproof hide and the backward tracks. But then he kept interviewing. He sat down with those 7 hunters who said they had killed one, and they gave him details he had not had before, including the shape of the teeth, 4 peg-like canines at the front of the mouth. So in a later paper, in 2001, Oren publicly revised his own conclusion. The teeth and the way the animal walked, he now argued, pointed not to a mylodontid but to a megalonychid, a different branch of the ground sloth family. He let the evidence change his mind in print. That is not how cranks behave. It is worth pausing to say that Oren was not the first to take the mapinguari seriously, and his sloth theory is not the only one on the table. The founding figures of cryptozoology, Bernard Heuvelmans and Ivan Sanderson, had both written about the creature decades earlier, and they leaned toward a different answer entirely. That the mapinguari was some kind of unknown great ape, a South American cousin to Bigfoot and the Yeti. Researchers like Lauren Coleman have continued to defend that ape interpretation, noting that some of the earliest descriptions sound more primate than sloth, and that an animal capable of pulling the tongues out of cattle would need enormous strength and dexterous hands. The debate between the ape camp and the sloth camp has never fully resolved. But what is striking is that Oren, the trained biologist who actually went into the field and collected the accounts, found the descriptions pointing away from an ape and toward the ground sloth. There is, after all, no fossil evidence of any primate anywhere near human size ever having lived in the New World, let alone one the size of a mapinguari. The sloth, at least, actually existed there. The consistency across all those interviews is the genuinely compelling part, and it is what the skeptics have the hardest time explaining away. Remember the anthropologist Glenn Shepard, who deserves a mention here because his story mirrors Oren's. Shepard was a hard skeptic. He considered the mapinguari nothing more than a rural legend right up until 1997, when he was doing field work with the Machigenga people in the Peruvian Amazon, hundreds of miles from Oren's witnesses. They described to him the same fearsome, sloth-like creature. And then came the moment Shepard says blew him away. One tribesman mentioned, completely matter-of-factly, that he had also seen a mapinguari at the Natural History Museum in Lima. The man had walked through that museum, looked at a reconstructed skeleton of an extinct giant ground sloth, and recognized it instantly as the monster from his forest.
A man who had never read a science textbook in his life walked into a museum, pointed at the bones of an extinct animal for 10,000 years, and said, "That is the thing we are afraid of." If you want a single moment that captured this mystery, that is it. And now I have to keep my promise to you from the beginning of this video. because here is where the floor gives way. For all the consistency of the testimony, for all the elegance of the ground sloth theory, David Oren spent decades trying to bring back a single piece of hard physical evidence, and every single time it dissolved in his hands.
This is the part of the story that does not get told often enough, and it is the most important part of all. Oren and his teams collected hair samples on those expeditions, clumps of coarse fur that witnesses or guides said came from the creature. They were analyzed. The hair came back as agouti, a common Amazonian rodent. He collected fecal samples, droppings he hoped would carry the DNA of something unknown. They were tested. In the most famous case on a Discovery Channel expedition where Oren partnered with the ground sloth paleontologist Greg McDonald, a local guide identified a dung sample as likely belonging to a mapinguari. The DNA analysis came back. It was an anteater. Other fecal samples were traced to tapir, an ordinary, well-known forest animal. And the footprint casts, the molds Oren made of those mysterious tracks? Oren himself, to his enormous credit as an honest scientist, admitted they held no real scientific weight, because in his own words, they could be easily faked. Think about what that means. Decades of field work, over 100 eyewitness accounts, 7 men who swore they had killed one. And when you set the testimony aside and ask the cold question, where is the body, where is the bone, where is the single sample of DNA from an animal science cannot name, the answer is there isn't one. The hair was a rodent, the dung was an anteater and a tapir. The casts could have been carved by anyone. The physical proof, every time, faded like tracks in the rain. The hardest-nosed skeptic in this story, a megafaunal extinction expert named Paul Martin, put it about as bluntly as a scientist can. He said there is no chance the creature is a surviving ground sloth, and added with a kind of grim humor that he would eat his share of sloth dung if the animal turned out to be alive. And the missing body is a bigger problem than it might first sound, so let me not soft pedal it. We are not talking about a small, shy creature that could plausibly slip through the cracks, like the insects and frogs that science genuinely is still cataloging in that forest. We are talking about an animal the size of a large bear or bigger, an animal that supposedly knocks down trees, that 7 different hunters claim to have shot dead. In a world of trail cameras, satellite imaging, indigenous communities who know that forest intimately, and a century of biologists actively combing the Amazon for new species, an animal that large should leave something behind, a skull, a jawbone, a clear photograph, a scrap of genuinely unidentifiable tissue. The total absence of any of that after this much searching is the skeptic's trump card, and it is a strong one. Extraordinary claims, as the saying goes, require extraordinary evidence. And what the mapinguari has produced in the cold light of the lab is the evidence of ordinary animals every single time. So that should be the end of it, right? The evidence collapsed. The samples were ordinary animals. Case closed, monster filed away under superstition. And if you're a strict skeptic, that is a completely fair place to land, and I am not going to tell you that you are wrong. But before you close the book entirely, I want to put 2 things back on the table, because this story has a way of refusing to die. The first is the science itself, and it cuts in an unexpected direction. We say the giant ground sloths went extinct 10,000 years ago, and on the mainland of the Americas, that is true. But it is not the whole truth. On the islands of the Caribbean, ground sloths held on for thousands of years longer than they did anywhere else. Researchers using radiocarbon dating have put the last known ground sloths on Cuba at around 4,200 years ago. Let that number sit. 4,200 years ago, when ground sloths were still alive on Cuba, the ancient Egyptians were already building pyramids. These animals did not all vanish in one clean Ice Age sweep. Pockets of them in the right isolated refuge survived deep into human history. And the Amazon basin is the single largest, least explored isolated refuge on the face of the planet. And there is a precedent that haunts this whole question, one that Oren himself knew well. Back in 1895, in a cave in Patagonia, explorers found a piece of ground sloth hide so fresh, so well preserved, with the hair still on it and the skin still flexible, that scientists at the time genuinely wondered whether the animal had died only recently. It set off a wave of expeditions convinced that living ground sloths might still be roaming the southern tip of South America. They were wrong, as it turned out. The hide was just extraordinarily well preserved in the cold, dry cave. But the episode left a permanent question mark hanging over the assumption that we know exactly when these animals died out. Even the governor of Argentina at the time, a man named Ramon Lista, claimed to have seen a strange, hairy, sloth-like creature while hunting in Patagonia. The idea that a ground sloth could have outrun its own extinction date is not a fringe internet fantasy. It is a question real scientists have been chewing on for more than a century. Which brings me to the second thing, the sheer, staggering scale of that forest. The Amazon covers more than 2 million square miles, and enormous stretches of it have never had a scientist set foot in them. New species, real ones, large ones, are still being pulled out of that jungle on a regular basis. Mark van Roosmalen, the same biologist who recorded that village relocation on the Purus, made his career discovering animals nobody knew existed. So when someone tells you with total confidence that there is no possible way a large animal could be hiding in the Amazon undetected, the honest answer is that we simply have not looked at most of it. Absence of evidence in a place that vast and that dark is not quite the same thing as evidence of absence. Now, let me be honest about my own read, because I owe you that. I do not think there is a population of giant ground sloths out there. The missing physical evidence is a problem you cannot wave away, and the skeptics have earned their position. But here's what I cannot shake, and what I don't think any amount of negative DNA results can fully erase. Those villages still moved. Real people on real rivers with real homes built by their own hands looked at something in the mud and made the wrenching, practical, clear-headed decision to abandon their land and put a river between themselves and whatever it was. They were not chasing fame. They were not selling a story. They were just leaving. And whatever made calm, forest-wise people do that again and again across generations and across hundreds of miles is a real phenomenon, even if the thing at the center of it is not the animal they think it is. The science says the ground sloths are gone. The DNA says rodent, anteater, tapir. But out on the upper Purus, there is a stretch of forest that good, brave people still will not enter. And the homes they left behind are still standing empty on the wrong side of the river. Maybe it was a memory. Maybe the Mapinguari is the ghost of a real animal, a giant ground sloth that walked beside the first people of the Amazon thousands of years ago and pressed itself so deeply into their stories that the fear outlived the beast by millennia. A monster made of memory, terrifying precisely because it was once real. Or maybe, just maybe, in the 2 million square miles of green that no one has ever fully walked, something is still out there, leaving tracks in the mud that send whole villages running. I have my doubts. You should have yours. But the next time you hear that the Amazon has given up all its secrets, I want you to picture that empty village in the dark, the open doorways and the swaying hammock, and the river the people put between themselves and the trees, and then ask yourself what you would have done.
If you made it all the way here, You are the kind of person I make these videos for. So thank you for being here. And until next time, keep your eyes on the tree line. I'm Alex, and I'll see you very soon.